Oh yeah.
Local Manners family, today we are joined by somebody that I have known since I was a young whippersnapper. And he is my first boss in my first real job. How you doing today, Rick?
Well, given that, it's amazing I'm still alive, I guess. So I'm very happy to be on this side of the grass.
Just to let y'all know, Rick Reinhard is just a little bit older than I am. I can't remember what year you graduated from William and Mary.
1977.
77. So he came out about 8 years before I did. So he's not that old, not old enough to be in the dirt. Today we are going to talk about a number of topics, not the least of which is the number of churches that are out there unoccupied, either because the congregation moved or because they closed down because they didn't have sufficient membership. There are lots of reasons that these buildings are out there. And Rick has developed a specialty of sorts in addressing the issues of underused, abandoned church buildings and how they can become better utilized or adapted to some other use. So, but before we get into that, Rick, please tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from. We already established that you went to the greatest university in the world, but tell us a little bit more about yourself, and then we'll get into the issue of churches.
Well, I grew up in upstate New York in Syracuse, the land of great snow. Went to William and Mary, came back to Syracuse and was a newspaper reporter covering mainly murder trials and political corruption trials. Then went to grad school in business and public management at Rice University in Houston. From there, spent 30 plus years in local economic development and some local city government as well, running business improvement districts, redevelopment authorities, and was the chief of staff in a strong mayor form of government to the mayor of Buffalo. About 9 years ago, I describe it, went from the darkness towards the light. And I went to work for the social justice agency of the global United Methodist Church. Here, I live in Rockville, Maryland now on Capitol Hill and worked for several years for the United Methodist Church, more on the business side of things of the church, working as chief administrative officer for the agency that is responsible for social justice, and then reporting to the Bishop of New Jersey, mainly on properties. About 4 years ago, pulled the plug on all that. I guess you could say semi-retired, moved from New Jersey back to DC, formed my own consulting firm called Niagra Consulting Group. And what I've been doing since then is working on the issue of reuse and redevelopment of churches. You described it really well. There's one other little piece, which is a lot of churches are finding that they have way too much space but want to continue operations. So maybe they're only using 10,000 square feet out of 50,000 square feet. So working on how do those churches lease out space to A, bring in some needed revenue, and B, expand their missions.
First off, I do also want to highlight before I get there, let me highlight we actually work together in Richmond, Virginia, and um, we work for a little organization called the Central Richmond Association that I don't think exists anymore. But we were in the business of providing information to downtown businesses. The project that you assigned to me, probably my first day, hey, we got this downtown data book, and I need you to work with this committee to get this book put together. You remember the downtown data book?
I totally remember it. We were a little bit ahead of the curve. I mean, decisions these days are made much more on data than on other things.
Yeah, that's right. And we put it together. I think if I dig through my stuff somewhere, I have a copy of it because I wanted to keep that. That was such a, it's like my first big thing that I had ever done. So
I
that
spent
was,
4 years in Georgia as well. I spent
mhm,
that time running an organizations called Central Atlanta Progress and the
progress.
Atlanta Downtown improvement district. So hello to my Georgia peeps.
All righty. Yeah, yeah. Central Atlanta Progress, I think, is still out there and doing well. I don't know who's doing the work that Central Richmond Association used to do. I used to kind of keep up with it and I could track the evolution of the organization, but I don't know what they're doing now.
They've
Um,
merged and they merged again and they merged again, and now they're part of a much larger organization called Venture Richmond.
Enter Richmond. Okay.
Yep,
All right. All right. I haven't been to Richmond in a while. I don't know about you, but the last time I was in Williamsburg was about 2022, I think. And I have the urge to go to campus to walk through and see all these changes. I don't know when the last time you've been there, but I've got it planned at Yates. My beloved Yates Hall that I lived in my freshman year has been demolished.
yep,
And I think I better go up there and walk through before I don't recognize anything,
you got it.
know, because it's changing now. The government department is over in Tucker, which just seems so weird to me because we were on new campus the whole time. But anyway, everything's changing. I plan to go up there soon so I can check it out.
Good.
Um, so yeah, let's talk about the First Baptist Church of Augusta. And prior to this episode, I also interviewed organizations called Historic Augusta. They work on historic preservation. I interviewed their director and we talked a little bit about that building because it's gotten pretty controversial. The First Baptist Church of Augusta probably moved out of there 40 years ago or so. It is in a nice tree-lined street in downtown Augusta on Green Street. Beautiful structure, got a nice little dome on top, big columns. Just a really attractive structure in its day. And I'm sure they moved out because they didn't have adequate parking at that location. They had the relatively small parking lot. And I'm sure also as the population of the city moved west, they moved west with it. And it left this big empty building. They had a couple of other structures that have been turned into either office space. One is an office building that's immediately adjacent to it. There's another building behind it that I think was a part of First Baptist that has ironically become the Catholic school. But the church sanctuary itself is still just sitting there. And, you can see the weeds sort of growing through, and it looks really bad. You've got homeless people that started hanging out there. And there was some hope for the structure when a local realtor purchased the building a few years ago, and I can't keep track of the timeline. But, he was threatening to demolish it at one point. Code enforcement from the city has been after him. It's just been one mess after another. I think the last I heard was at least he was going to do something up on the roof to try to prevent the water from coming in, which of course was doing a lot of damage, as you can imagine. So if you go into a community like this, I mean, what do you tell folks?
Well, the first thing I say is it's really important for a municipality to look at one building like that, but it's also really important to take a look at all of the churches in town and all of the houses of worship and find out where they're at. And there's a tsunami of closing churches, emptying out churches happening across America. The big historic structures are the most difficult and the most heartbreaking because if you think of something like an old department store building, it's kind of square and it's relatively easy to reuse, relatively easy to turn it into apartments or offices or something like that. A church with a sanctuary and big ceilings and often slate roofs and stained glass windows, they're just really, really, really difficult to reuse. The preservationists, on the one hand, want everything to be restored exactly as it was. What the downtown business community wants, of course, is for something to go in there and for the building not to deteriorate. because what ends up happening is it ends up deteriorating so much that, like the one you described, it becomes an eyesore. In general, private developers, private property owners cannot do that on their own. They just can't because there's no return in it for them. So what's really important in something like the First Baptist Church you're talking about is to sort of check your guns and knives at the door, the public sector, the private sector, the business community, look at some other models and figure out what it could be and how much money it's going to take. In order just to operate a church these days, it costs somewhere between $8 and $12 per square foot. So for even a small church of 10,000 square feet, and that's relatively small, it can cost $100,000 a year just to operate the building. Never mind paying a pastor, never mind buying candles or doing missions or things like that. And that cannot be produced by a couple of dozen 80-year-olds who go there on Sunday. So at a place like First Baptist Church, there has to be some alternate uses. I mean, what's the demand for these things? And then everybody really needs to get together and join hands and figure out, well, how can we get from here to there? It can't just be rely on a single private property owner to do it because unless they're Bill Gates or Elon Musk or somebody like that, and they have a reason in their hearts to do it, it's just not going to happen.
You make a good point. You can't do it by yourself. It's got to be a cooperative effort to think about what fits there. You know, Interestingly, on that street, and I have no idea how well the congregations are doing, but there is a Presbyterian church that is behind them and up a block that seems to be thriving. There is believe a United Methodist Church and another Catholic church, that set up where that's sort of the church district in an older downtown. They're right there in the middle of that sort of church district, and the others seem to have figured it out, at least from what I can tell. I don't know their bottom line, but they have stayed in the area, and there's a Lutheran church across the street too. So they have stayed in the area, and the Lutheran church has actually done an add-on. The Presbyterian church has done an add-on. So I would assume that they're doing pretty good. But the Baptist one, gone. And I guess they probably were tired of fighting with the Methodists for parking because they're all so close together, and everybody was parking there on the street, so that made it real tough. Um, Office reuse used to be a thing, right? But is that still a thing, or is that kind of disappeared now that we're in the work from home environment?
The office market in general is pretty tough, but of course, at one location in one community, folks might be able to find an office user. Typically, those that are continuing to expand are institutional users like colleges, like hospitals, and the like.
Okay, okay. And colleges, that's a really interesting one. Augusta is the city of colleges. I don't know if you knew that. We've got several, Augusta University is expanding. In fact, when I was younger, Augusta College was one thing, and the Medical College of Georgia was a separate thing. They've now merged under one umbrella,
Hmm,
which took place probably 10, 12 years ago. And hospitals are a growth industry, as you indicate. It's a little ways away from our medical district, but I could see that perhaps there would be a need for some office space there for people who work in associated with the schools or with the hospitals.
right.
And also, Payne College is in town. Augusta Technical College has expanded their footprint. So, yeah, that would be an interesting thing to explore if there were any possible educational uses for that space.
And to give kind of a national perspective, the former vice president for research and planning of the National Council of Churches has estimated that by the end of the next decade, something like 100,000 houses of worship nationwide out of 400,000 are going to close. In when I was in New Jersey, just for instance, we surveyed our 500 plus Methodist churches, United Methodist churches in New Jersey. Of them, 20% were in critical condition, probably already should have closed. 40% were in serious condition. Only 40% were in fair to good condition. And that's not unique with United Methodist and New Jersey. In my old hometown of Buffalo, where I had been chief of staff to the mayor, the Roman Catholic bishop just announced the closing of somewhere between 70 and 90 Roman Catholic churches all at once. Now, they had a bit of a special case because so many, there are so many judgments against the Roman Catholic Church in sexual abuse cases. They declared bankruptcy. The bankruptcy court judge said, pay these folks. And, the only way really they can pay them is by selling property. But just think about that in a relatively small 8 county area, somewhere between 70 and 90 Roman Catholic churches closing all at once. It's really devastating.
That really is. And as you mentioned that, are there new churches opening to offset all those old closures? They're just in different locations. Do you have any idea what's driving that? Or
That
people
there,
just not going to church?
for the most part, people just aren't going to church. A Gallup poll showed that over the last 2 generations, that the percentage of people in America who consider themselves to be members of one church or another has decreased from 72% to 47%. I mean, and in addition to membership dropping, attendance is dropping. And in addition to that, giving is dropping. Now, I don't mean there aren't examples here and there of churches that are succeeding, churches that are starting. In particular, non-denominational churches are doing better than traditional churches. Um, Muslim houses of worship are doing better. Latter-day Saints are doing better. But if you take a look at the big picture, attendance, giving, membership are falling off a cliff.
Wow.
And I believe, people are saying why. I really think there's 4 reasons. One reason is that folks just aren't as religious. They're taking their kids to travel basketball and travel gymnastics on Sunday morning. Another one is that costs are increasing. Insurance, utilities, construction, you name it, and in addition to that, it used to be that in the late 1800s, early 1900s, the only way to get to church was by walking or riding a horse. Well, now not only do we have cars, we've got the internet. And so if you want to participate in services from the Archbishop of Canterbury or the Dalai Lama, you only need to open your computer and push a button and do it. And then finally, fourth, there was a negative influence from COVID-19, but all of those reasons are out there.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring up that point. So these empty church buildings, in many ways, are symptoms of larger changes that are taking place in our society.
Very much so. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. And so just like when we were young, department stores were closing. I'm sure Augusta
Mhm.
had downtown
Oh yeah, for
department
sure.
stores,
Uh-huh.
when we were young. Now church and why did they close? Well, first because of mega stores like Walmart, second because of online shopping, third because of small, very specialized stores,
Mhm.
hockey stores, for instance, cookie shops. But just like they have had a big economic changes, churches are having big economic changes. And I think ironically, they're replaced by the same stuff that retail stores got replaced by. That is, number one, replaced by mega churches, number two, replaced by online, and then number three, and this is somewhat hidden, replaced by small, very specialized churches. So, with the United Methodists in New Jersey, three of the four largest United Methodist churches in the entire state of New Jersey are Korean United Methodist churches, where the largest Episcopal church in the Diocese of Virginia is a Bolivian Episcopal church. I mean, it isn't something that people think about. So, what I've said is if a community church is going to survive, they've either got to one, go mega, two, seriously go online, or three, really figure out what their strength is and play to that strength. So that is be the church with the best music in the region, or be affiliated with one ethnicity, or be the most progressive Protestant church in the area, something like that, that they're really, really known for.
You know what? That's really interesting as you say that. And that may also then be behind the trend that I think I'm recognizing with churches doing more to appear as if they are Christian entertainment
Right,
than they are houses of worship. They do the next big thing to attract more and more people. I probably spend too much time on my YouTube feed watching people who are criticizing churches for going too commercial. They're loaded with gimmicks.
right.
They're doing things that appear to be too worldly. In the form of in the idea of the traditionalists, they're being too worldly. They are doing things that are completely different from what our church experience was 30 years ago. But they're doing that because they think they have to do something different to attract more people to come in.
And churches are also sharing their space with other houses of worship. So just down the road from where we live is Veers Mill Baptist Church. They proudly state that they share their space with four other churches,
Mhm.
virtually all of them ethnic congregations. Now, the
Mhm.
old model was, well, we don't want to share our space with those other people. Well, now the model has to be we share it with everybody, or the church can't afford the $8 to $12 a square foot it costs to run the building. I mean, I think it's the right thing to do,
Mhm.
under the eyes of God, but it's also the right thing to do in terms of the pocketbook.
Yeah, that's very much the right thing to do. Speaking of that, I had one at one instance, and I'm gonna try to hide the identity of the church, but this church was one of the biggest buildings in a particular town, and they told our voter registration and elections director that they wouldn't be a polling place anymore. And I was just sort of like, it's the biggest place in town.
Yeah.
And we're talking about a couple of days. What's the problem?
The old model, my friend Tom Frank was a professor at the Candler School of Divinity at Emory,
Hmm.
and we've written together and conspired about all of this stuff. And we wrote an article that said the old model of a church, a big stone building on a hill with an iron picket fence around it and eight doors, and every one of them's locked, and they won't let anybody use their parking lot to play in or play hopscotch in or play stickball in. That's passé. It just doesn't work anymore. That the church really needs to be open, without the fence. And I understand there's security issues, don't get me wrong, but both literally and metaphorically with unlocked doors and used as polling places and used as a coffee shop and all of that. The mixed, real estate folks learned many years ago that mixed use is where it's at. That a property has to be residences and office and retail and food in order to succeed. Well, churches really need to do the same thing. One of my best friends from William and Mary is a retired United Church of Christ minister. He's told me about a church out in the country in Maryland where they bake pies. There's a pie business there. And he has said to me, kind of chuckling, it's almost developed into a pie factory that once in a while, 1 or 2 days a week, has services
Hmm.
rather than a church that once in a while bakes pies. But I think that's the sort of thinking we need everywhere.
It really is. That cooperative spirit is something that hopefully Americans will be more amenable to as we move forward. Interestingly, you mentioned when you were talking about the Catholic Diocese and all of the issues that they have had, that reminded me that our first American Pope, Pope
It's
Leo
like
14,
Louis,
that's
just
it.
like
Okay.
Louis.
Okay. All right. He's from a suburb of Chicago. I believe it's Dalton, Illinois, which has been in the news for a whole different set of reasons that are not so good over the last couple of years. The congregation where he grew up, I think they had closed that building and are looking around to figure out what to do with it. So this has hit everybody, everywhere.
Well, and it's a real change, not only for the religious community, but also for municipalities. Because what does Ottumwa, Iowa, a small city in Iowa, do when over the last decade, eight downtown churches have closed? And three have been successfully redeveloped, three relatively unsuccessfully, two are empty, and the Main Street manager fears that three more may close. Macon, Georgia has 15 churches in a 3 by 6 block area downtown. Now, I haven't gone in to figure out the health of all of them, but you can bet that with many of them, there's what I call the great mismatch. And the great mismatch is between small aging congregations and
Mhm.
large deteriorating buildings. It doesn't work.
Yeah, math does not work. That is interesting. Also, I thought about downtown Augusta when you mentioned all the churches in a concentrated area there in Macon. Augusta had a similar problem, and I guess some of it resolved itself. And maybe those denominations took it upon themselves because there was a Presbyterian church, another Presbyterian church, within walking distance of the one that I referenced earlier that appears to be really thriving. That one closed down and is now part of a homeless mission or something like that. It's a help center for people who need help. So that is wonderful that that church has been reused and it's been in place with that use, I think, now for a number of years. And what was the Sacred Heart Catholic Church has become a cultural center. And it's
Right,
a beautiful, beautiful building. They rent out space there. The Arts Council's office is there. I think there are a few other nonprofits that have a presence in that building. And that has been a success story. Now, folks have the most beautiful weddings. They have a great Christmas program. A lot of good things are happening in there while the Catholic Church consolidated at the other locations that I mentioned
right.
that's closer to the old First Baptist. So some of the denominations seems to have taken it upon themselves to make those adjustments themselves over the years, I guess, as their population or their congregations declined in size. Do you see a lot of that? Is that unusual or is that pretty typical?
It's rare that the faith community is ahead of the curve. Often what happens is they're in denial and they wait and wait and wait until pretty much the only thing they can do is to hire a realtor and put a sign out front. But it's beautiful when it happens. And again, I think one of the challenges is that municipalities need to be willing partners in all of that. All too often the zoning is antiquated. So it's not unusual for the zoning around church properties to be, guess what? The zoning is that it has to be a church. And if you
Mhm.
look, 30, 40, 50 years ago, it was impossible to contemplate that it might be something else. Similarly with building codes, public safety building codes, stormwater runoff, there are often parking requirements that say, well, we need at least one parking space for every three people who might fit in the pews. Well, people aren't fitting in the pews
They're
these
not.
days, or they might be fitting in them on Easter at Christmas, but not the other days. And often the historic preservation laws mitigate against reuse as well. So I won't get into all the details, but it used to be that in order to get federal and sometimes state historic tax credits, you had to agree not to divide the sanctuary into other units, which in essence made it almost impossible to turn a church into residential units or office units. I mean, you could do the school or the education wing, but it became almost impossible to do the sanctuary. Well, is it more important to reuse the building for a good use? P.S. And I know I'm talking to a former city manager here.
Mhm.
Get that building on the tax rolls,
Yeah,
producing local
it's a
property
good thing.
taxes, or is it better to sit back and say, well, it's really an overwhelming thing that we can't subdivide the sanctuary, So I think municipalities really have to look at their own regulations and be willing partners in helping make things happen.
And that's why everybody has to be at the table to understand the challenge and what slight changes might be made in order to overcome those challenges.
Exactly.
That is a great way to look at this. We say in any other problem facing local government, it's like, well, let's all sit around the table and talk and figure out what the issues really are. So just like any other problem, you might be trying to address the same thing with the problem of empty and abandoned church structures.
The big trend nationally is to turn surplus faith properties into affordable housing. And at one
Mhm.
level, that makes all the sense in the world because, on the one hand, there's a great surplus of faith properties. On the other hand, at least in most of America, there's a great dearth of affordable housing. Um, the state of California, Washington state, and my home state of Maryland have passed state legislation to incentivize churches and, in some cases, other not-for-profits to transform their property into affordable housing. Locally, Mayor Dickens in Atlanta has done a great job getting legislation passed locally in Atlanta to do the same thing. And they have planning staff dedicated to helping faith properties turn themselves into both market rate and affordable housing. My one concern is that it doesn't make sense for every single faith property everywhere at every time to be turned into affordable housing. You've got to look at the properties and the local property market. You've got to look at the individual properties. You've got to look at the congregation and the judicatory over the
Mhm.
congregation. You got to look at the resources. And it may make more sense, for instance, to redevelop it into a cultural center. It may make, particularly with a lot of the churches built in the 50s and 60s, which are really unexceptional, to tear them down and do something else with the land. Not every single one should be preserved. But still, I think the nationwide trend of turning surplus faith properties into affordable housing makes a lot of sense, particularly in a big metro area like I am in the DC area, where frankly local governments are desperate for affordable housing. Our police officers, teachers, firefighters can't afford to live in the communities where they work. It costs too
Yeah,
much.
yeah, yeah. That those are all great ideas. So there are a lot of options, but people just need to think about what those are. They need to think. They need to have lots of conversations, and the regulations need to be friendly towards adaptive reuse.
Absolutely. And in a robust real estate market, let's think New York City or Miami or San Francisco, the developers sort of circle overhead of emptying churches like buzzards,
Mhm,
waiting for the churches to close so
mhm,
they can swoop in and turn them into luxury condos. In markets like Ottumwa, Iowa, or Buffalo, or I'm guessing Augusta, it's a lot more challenging because there's not necessarily a robust real estate market. Or, put a different way, there may be some neighborhoods that are robust real estate markets and other ones that are not. And the answers are very different depending upon whether there's a really strong real estate market or there's a fairly weak real estate market.
Yeah, you mentioned the robust real estate markets. That reminds me of the church that some of my cousins grew up in Washington, D.C., Northeast D.C., sat there forever. Probably nobody, they were still operating church out of a pretty old building. And all of a sudden, Northeast D.C. gets hot. And I think a developer just came in and offered to buy the property without them closing down. They weren't trying to leave. They just got an offer they couldn't refuse.
And often churches can take advantage of their surplus property by doing some sort of a partnership with a developer.
Hmm.
Could be a for-profit developer, could be a not-for-profit affordable housing developer. And there's great examples of that all over DC, in the city, in the suburbs, with white churches, with African American churches, with ethnic churches. In some, the church continues to own the property, and some they sell the property and lease their sanctuary back. There's all sorts of different really good
Mhm.
models.
I think they completely tore down the structure. I think the developer swooped in and said, "Hey, we'll offer you X amount of dollars." The church said, "Yeah, we'll take that deal." And they tore it down and have built some luxury apartments. It's beautiful, but that does speak to the DC market. As you said, some of these markets where property is really in demand. Um,
First United Methodist Church in downtown Miami sold to a private developer for, take a deep breath here, $55 million.
wow.
The developer put up a skyscraper. The church took some of that 55 million and leased back part of the first and second floor, or I think actually
Mhm,
purchased back a condo technically
mhm.
on the first floor. First United Methodist Church of Seattle sold for $30 million. First Presbyterian Church of Tampa sold for $5.5 million. But, that's not going to happen in Buffalo or Augusta.
Mm-mm, no, it won't be that type of money. And the building I started off talking about, the old First Baptist, it's changed hands, I think, a few times since the church left. And they just haven't, the magic answer has not been found in order
Right.
to do something with that structure. And it is one of those distinguished sort of structures. I'm sure it's more than 100 years old. And it was like a Greek revival style. So that it is of architectural significance. So it would be great to see something done that preserves that architecture there.
Exactly. And it really picks up the entire downtown if that happens, you
It
know.
really does. It really does. And it'd be great if it fits in because there's so many other churches around there. It'd be great if it sort of fits in there. But that has been a challenge, but hopefully it will be successfully addressed. As you say all these things, I start thinking about other churches where I've seen reuse. One of them is my old polling place when I lived in Charlotte. It was a relatively small church on a few acres, and they were having attendance issues as well. I think at one point they merged with another congregation and that built attendance for a while, but along comes a developer that has now placed about 30 townhouses on what used to be that church property. They just raised it and turned it into townhomes. So it is meeting the housing need in an area that is very much in demand. There's another church not far from me in Charlotte that was on this huge piece of property. I mean, it was probably on 20, 30 acres or something. And it was just a big church and their daycare center sitting in the middle of this huge piece of property in South Park, Charlotte. So developer came along, created this mixed use. There's a much smaller church in there now, surrounded by apartment buildings, hotels, restaurants, the whole 9 yards. It became a very successful mixed use project across the street from one of Charlotte's premier malls. So
Yeah, that's called South Park Church now. I
South Park Church, exactly. And the restaurants over there are great. So we love going over there when we're in town. But yeah, there are lots of options depending upon the needs of that particular community, the demand for real estate. I mean, I think, the real estate demand in downtown Augusta isn't the greatest. The area where that church is located is pretty nice. So
well,
I hope that there's some things that can be done there.
there's two other things quickly we've got to talk about. One is graveyards, which is many churches have graveyards right
Mhm.
next to it, and that on the one hand, that's nice. On the other hand, it really complicates any sort of reuse or redevelopment. And
Mhm.
the other thing is many churches have what are called reversionary clauses in their leases or in their deeds, where a family originally gave the land to a church with the proviso that it always
Always be a
be a
church.
church, and if it's not going to be a church, and it doesn't matter if the reversionary clause comes from the 1800s, that property needs to revert to be given back to, let's say, the family that gave the land. And in New Jersey, our bishop came up with great plans for one site, only to find after the architect came up with the drawings and he went to the annual conference and he had a press conference and he went to the city, that there was a reversionary clause and they had to give the land back to something called the Ocean Grove Camp Meeting Association, which in the late 1800s had donated the land.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, there are all sorts of things that can complicate these pictures. As you have gathered all of this information, do you actually do consulting with somebody that say we have this building, we can't figure out what to do with it? Can you help
Yeah,
us?
yeah, I do. I tend to do consulting with what we call judicatories, meaning dioceses and
Hmm.
presbyteries and
Hmm.
associations and the like, because I'm really interested strategically, how should these things be changed, and also with communities. But most recently, I've been doing some work with the Episcopal Diocese of Virginia, which has set up a separate not-for-profit corporation that is working with individual churches on reuse and redevelopment, which is a whole lot of fun. You mentioned Charlotte. My good friend Joel Gilland heads an organization called Wesley Community Development Corporation that's been very successful doing that for the Western North Carolina Annual Conference of the United Methodist Church. And he's been so successful that about 4 or 5 other annual conferences of the United Methodists have actually brought him in to work on churches in their districts as well, including North Georgia, interestingly enough. So yeah, I'm doing some of that. I've published a whole slew of articles on what could and should be done. Half of them are published in religious publications. The other half are published in urban planning, city management type publications, just to get people thinking about this. I have discovered that one of the big hurdles in this whole area is that neither churches nor municipalities are really thinking much about this. And in Buffalo, although between 70 and 90 churches are closing, it's just not in the top 100 issues that are on the agenda of the mayor or the county executives, because
Right.
they got a lot going on. But it's
Yeah.
going to come up and really bite them over the next few years.
Yeah. Because I think we'll find that all the challenges are connected. Yeah, that if a church is not thriving where it is, one of the reasons may be because people are just moving away from that area, which is a local government problem that folks need to focus on. If you're losing population density in a particular area, why? And what I always like to think about was if you got a densely populated area, it's much easier to provide services to the
Right.
area. It's much easier to do street sweeping and garbage collection when every house on the block is occupied. When you got to start skipping around town and expanding your routes further south, west, east, wherever that population is going, that increases the cost of delivering services. So,
Janice,
so yeah, the
you're
challenges are
absolutely right.
connected.
And on top of that, churches are where people worship, but often it's also places where there are clothing closets or food
Mhm.
pantries or health clinics, um, Alcoholics Anonymous, Overeaters Anonymous meetings, and the like. And when that church closes, those sorts of places don't have anywhere to go.
Mhm.
And that ends up being the problem of city and county governments.
And the problem, as in the one I started with, yes, homeless people start hanging out there.
Right.
They got in
Exactly.
the building, it became a code enforcement issue. So yeah, all of the challenges are connected. Thank you so much for this conversation.
Well,
Is there
thank you,
anything else you want to
Janice.
share with us before we close out?
Well, just this is a big issue, and I think it's really important to address it, not just kick the can down the road. All too often, particularly folks my age, when they go to church, what they start thinking about is all I really want is for my funeral service to be here when I die. And instead, they really need to think about what about the future? How are we going to serve the community? What about kids and grandchildren and nieces and nephews?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Thanks so much. It's so good talking to you
It's great.
again.
It's great seeing you too, Janice.
All right.
Take care.